Germany's seat of democracy is ablaze. The Reichstag fire is a pivotal moment for Germany in 1933. The inferno destroys the building, and in just 2 months, the Constitution is suspended, giving the Nazi Party the power to bypass Parliament. This is Adolf Hitler's first step in transforming Germany from democracy to dictatorship. History is littered with examples of how dictators have come to power. But what are the common themes? What are the circumstances that lead to tyranny? And what techniques do they use to get to the top? Dictators believe they have the answer to fix society's problems. They have a vision of what their nation could be. But before they can reshape a culture, before they can promise a new world, they need to discredit existing ideologies. They need to foster a sense of discontent. They need to start by tearing down the old.
A dictatorship is where one person holds all the power. There isn't any representation, there isn't any turnover in power, there isn't really any civil liberties.
Dictatorship is the opposite of democratic rule because it strikes at the heart of the democratic process, of the will of the people, of the rule of the parliament, of the existence of laws, and so on.
Whether a dictator seizes power or exploits an existing system, every dictator believes their actions to be legitimate. And the 20th century saw the arrival of some of history's most well-known dictators.
During the interwar years, there are several common characteristics of these dictatorships and the environments in which they rose to power. These countries were facing a lot of social and economic disarray, and you also saw the need for these charismatic style leaders that were going to promise to solve everyone's problems.
And these dictatorships share a number of common elements with all dictatorships across history, even today.
The dictators of that period perfected every step towards total control. Every action had a specific purpose. And whether or not politicians today with similar aspirations knowingly follow that same playbook, the techniques are laid out for us all to see. "15 years before the fire that destroyed the Reichstag, Hitler was nobody, a message runner in the First World War. When he returned home in November 1918, decorated for his bravery, he entered a very different Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II had abdicated, and the nation was grappling with democracy in the form of its new government, the Weimar Republic. Before Hitler could rise to power, he would have to dismantle this fledgling democracy.
Germany emerges from the First World War in a state of turmoil. Of course, the war has finished with a crushing defeat. A defeat on the military level, but also on the psychological level, not least because people are not prepared for a defeat.
The Social Democrats decisively won the 1919 election to lead the Weimar Republic. However, in the wake of the First World War, one of their first political acts was to sign the Treaty of Versailles at the Paris Peace Conference, a decision that proved deeply unpopular with the German people. Article 231 of the treaty made Germany accept blame for the war and locked the nation into punishing reparations. The sting of defeat led to national trauma. The socialists blamed the military establishment, and returning soldiers, feeling betrayed, were drawn to a movement of radical nationalism. Violence in post-war Germany was rampant. Germany had lost a significant portion of its population and territory. Many citizens yearned for the bygone empire and blamed the Social Democrats for its loss. A young Adolf Hitler concurred, believing the Weimar Republic to be feeble and that democracy was essentially a Jewish idea. He blamed the Jews and the bourgeois elite for all of Germany's misfortunes.
Very soon, Germany is also plunged into an economic crisis in the early 1920s, hyperinflation, which creates even more distance and estrangement between large sections of the public opinion and the new government. And then these are years of political turmoil.
Hitler saw an opportunity to tap into the strong sense of nationalism that permeated German society.
Hitler had been interested from quite a young age in political ideas, in ideology, and he developed a lot of his nationalism and anti-Semitism during his years in Vienna. Once he joined the Nazi Party, he started to find his voice and really to put those ideas into speeches. He kind of found it quite intoxicating.
Unser deutsches Volk, unser Vaterland! Mit der heißesten Anteilnahme verfolgt. Wer sie geschlagen hat, hat uns geschlagen!
His speeches were a litany of rants against the Weimar Republic, blaming it for the nation's internal divisions, economic failures, and national humiliation. And it worked. The Nazi Party's popularity continued to grow, finding allies in many former army officers. The Nazis presented themselves as the beacon of hope, strength, and youth at a time when many Germans felt that capitalism and democracy had failed them.
Germany was facing all kinds of economic and social problems. You had extreme levels of polarization, and amidst all this economic and social chaos, you see the rise of a charismatic leader like Hitler, who is there to solve everyone's problems.
Hitler had taken his first steps towards tearing down the old regime and towards ultimate power. But even before Hitler, across Europe, economic depression and political fragmentation provided fertile ground for the rise of other dictators who promised strength and stability. In Italy, in 1919, Benito Mussolini held a profound skepticism towards democracy, considering it to be a flawed system. He believed that political parties were a sham and that fascism was simpler, everyone organized under state power. And so, he sought to transform Italy to make his vision become a reality. But he didn't always feel this way.
There are two Mussolinis. There is a Mussolini before the summer of 1914 and the Mussolini after 1914. The first Mussolini, the young politician, journalist, activist, is a socialist, and he is extreme in his views. What happens in 1914, of course, is the First World War breaks out. And the First World War divides the socialist parties across Europe. Because in ideological terms, no socialist party should have supported this war. It was a war dominated by nationalist feelings, by old countries.
But Mussolini sensed a shift in Italian sentiment towards nationalism. And with political aspirations, he decided to realign his position.
And Mussolini, in theory at least, makes a spectacular conversion from radical revolutionary socialism to radical, indeed one could say revolutionary nationalism.
After the war, Mussolini established the Fascist Party in 1919. The movement promised to save Italy from communist revolution and evoked themes of the restoration of Roman glory.
After the end of the First World War in Italy, a combination of political, economic and social factors led to the rise of fascism.
As the 1921 elections approached, many who once rallied behind the socialists now gravitated toward the fascists.
Italy was facing extreme polarization at this time. There was a rising communist movement, a huge labor movement. The country was being paralyzed by workers' strikes, and the country was ripe for a Mussolini-style leader to come in and focus on hyper-nationalistic style agenda where Italy would return to the days of ancient Rome.
But in the 1921 elections, Mussolini and his fascist party couldn't secure a majority. So, they were forced to form a right-wing coalition, with Luigi Facta from the Italian Liberal Party as Prime Minister. Mussolini's radical stance often brought him into conflict with other coalition members. He privately encouraged the Black Shirts, violent action squads who would attack and destroy properties of socialist and communist organizations.
And what Mussolini and his squads of black shirts could do was say, well, actually, we're defending the country against its enemies, against communism, against the Red Threat.
Little by little, fascist power started growing in regional strongholds in the center and north of Italy.
By October 1922, Mussolini was confident enough in his backing to execute his ultimate coup. Capitalizing on the government's weakness and fears of a socialist revolution, Mussolini threatened a mass demonstration in Rome to rescue Italy. On the 28th of October, the fascist demonstrators and black shirt paramilitaries approached Rome.
The fascists had a whole propaganda myth surrounding this as their moment in which they seized power as some kind of unstoppable force. They claimed that 100,000 fascists were ready to take the capital, but in fact only 20,000 marched, and they were waiting some kilometers outside Rome for orders which never came.
But it worked. Fearing bloodshed, King Victor Emmanuel III persuaded Prime Minister Facta to resign and invited Mussolini to form a new government. Just a month later, the Chamber of Deputies gave Mussolini emergency powers to counter the socialist threat. Now, he could chip away at established institutions and enhance the powers of the police and militia groups to eliminate all opposition. This was Mussolini's first step towards absolute authority. Keenly watching these events from less than 1,000 kilometers away, a 34-year-old Adolf Hitler was imagining his own rise to power. He marveled at Mussolini's bold, Machiavellian approach.
The fascist always inspired him, but of course Mussolini's march on Rome in October 1922 becomes the model of what he wants to do. Little over a year later, he organizes his own march in Munich, which goes catastrophically wrong.
On the evening of November 8, 1923, Hitler and a few supporters and members of the paramilitary organization, the Sturmabteilung, or SA, stormed into a Munich beer hall where another right-wing leader was delivering a speech. Brandishing a revolver, Hitler declared the dawn of a national revolution. They marched to the heart of the city, culminating in a gun battle with police. "15 Nazis, 4 police officers, and 1 civilian were killed. Hitler fled. The rebels were soon arrested, and Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in prison for treason. The event, commonly known as the Beer Hall Putsch, made headlines and cemented Hitler's reputation as a Nazi leader, a beacon of right-wing nationalism. Hitler spent only 9 months in prison, during which time he refined his beliefs and strategy, detailing them in his book, Mein Kampf. Under his renewed leadership, fascism would become integral to the Nazi Party. This time, however, they would leverage the existing political system and rise to power legally through a popular vote. Through the 1920s, Hitler consolidated his power as leader of the Nazi Party. But despite his efforts, the party had meager results in the 1924 and 1928 elections. In the aftermath of the Great Depression, however, the Nazi Party made huge political gains. Widespread economic misery in Germany provided fertile grounds for the Nazis, who offered a strong, decisive alternative to a weak government.
Existing governments simply couldn't deal with the economic, political, and social crisis. By July 1932, the Nazi Party had the largest number of votes and was the biggest party in the Reichstag.
But they fell short of a majority, so Hitler worked to form a conservative coalition with himself as leader.
The head of a German state is the revered, but very old and frail at that time, President Hindenburg. The man who didn't want to appoint Hitler. He despised him. But in the end, he relented because his own entourage were actually pressing him to appoint Hitler.
And so, in January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor. Although not the people's first choice, his ascent to power was legitimate, just as he'd planned. He swiftly positioned key Nazi figures, such as Hermann Goering, into influential roles. The German public, perhaps exhausted from the constant political shifts, seemed largely indifferent to the emerging Nazi regime. But soon, events would reveal the Nazi Party and its leader as no ordinary democratic government. While Hitler and Mussolini's ideologies fueled their rise to power, in China, it wasn't a fascist that would ascend to the role of dictator, but a founding member of the Chinese Communist Party, Mao Zedong. But his path to power would be a long and bloody one. The Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, was formed in 1921. Its rival, the Kuomintang, or KMT, formed only 2 years earlier, had nationalist ideals. Together, they formed an uneasy alliance to end political turmoil in China.
The reason why these parties formed that united front was at actually the Comintern's behest. They encouraged all communist parties in Asia, including China, to coexist and collaborate with the bourgeois nationalist parties in their country, rather than launch revolution immediately against them.
However, With such a chasm between their ideologies, the coalition was doomed, and it fell apart in 1927, leading to the Shanghai Massacre. Between 5,000 and 10,000 communists and leftists were brutally purged by militias, directed by Kuomintang General Chiang Kai-shek. This was the beginning of the Chinese Civil War. And this was when Mao would make his mark.
A lot of the party members and a lot of the surviving members from the Shanghai Massacre will establish in the Jinggangshan mountain areas, and they will set themselves up there and establish somewhat of a state within a state that will last until 1934.
By October of that year, warlord armies working for the nationalist Kuomintang government had encircled the communist areas, forming a blockade. But the CCP forces, the Red Army, found the right moment to break through gaps in the blockade.
And the communists must then go into the strategic retreat, whereby they will pass through some of the most brutal and unforgiving terrain in China.
This retreat became known as the Long March, an arduous 8,000-mile trek lasting a full year and involving more than 97,000 people. They marched over mountainous terrain and through uncharted country, taking fire from local warlords and from Chiang Kai-shek's warplanes. In November, the Red Army lost nearly 40,000 troops when they encountered the nationalists at the Shan River. The devastating loss forced the Communist Party to rethink its strategy. And in a conference in January 1935, the army commanders were replaced with a new group of leaders, including Mao. His political cunning had awarded him a position more powerful and prominent than ever.
Mao will turn a very kind of ragtag assemblage of surviving communists and whoever else they could recruit during their storm membership drives into a very hardened group of devoted followers who will believe that Mao's contributions above anyone else's establish him as the supreme theorist of the party and the would-be leader.
In 1937, hostilities between the Kuomintang and the CCP eased, as the two groups formed another fragile union to defend China from Japanese invasion during the Second Sino-Japanese War. But in 1945, after Japan's surrender and defeat at the end of the Second World War, China's civil war continued.
During this kind of last stage of the Civil War after World War II, the hyperinflation by the nationalists printing a lot of money to, of course, fund the war effort had led to an even widening gap of rich and poor in China, a vacuum that the Communist Party was all too willing to occupy.
In September 1949, the Communists finally seized control of the country. And on October 1st, standing on the rostrum of Tiananmen Gate, Mao Zedong proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China and took his place as chairman. Now, all that was left was to consolidate his power. Like Mao, some dictators build their regime from nothing, whereas others twist existing regimes in their favor. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin used his extraordinary administrative and political skills to rise to power within a massive bureaucracy. He did not tear down the old system, so much as bend it to his will. A member of the Bolsheviks, Stalin played a valuable supporting role during the 1917 revolution. And after they seized power, Vladimir Lenin gave Stalin his first break.
In 1922, he gets appointed General Secretary of the Bolshevik Party, which was a position pretty much nobody else wanted because the intellectuals in the party saw it as some kind of menial job for somebody who really liked to file membership cards. But that became the backbone of Stalin's power in the party because he knew the cadres very well.
In this role, Stalin was involved in shaping state policy, but he also had significant influence over party appointments, allowing him to place his supporters in key positions. Lenin died in 1924, and immediately a series of succession struggles emerged.
There was no succession mechanism. Stalin had to fight. He fought against Lenin's closest comrades. He had to show to the Communist Party that he was the true Leninist, that he was the true successor.
Братья и сестры в тылу наших врагов.
There's several potential rivals, but the two most prominent probably are Trotsky, who had built the Red Army and was also very popular within the party. The other major contender would have been Bukharin, another intellectual, an economist. The problem with him was that he wasn't very popular within the Bolshevik party.
Stalin's control over the party's machinery gave him an advantage.
So he was fighting, let's say, for the apostolic status. He was the true apostle. And all the other ones were Judases. Trotsky was the super traitor, the hyper renegade. So it took time for Stalin to establish his absolute power.
With unyielding ruthlessness, he eliminated all potential party rivals, branding many as deviationists. By the end of the 1920s, Stalin had forced Trotsky into exile and firmly established himself as the supreme leader of the Soviet Union. Much like Mao, Stalin's next steps were to consolidate that power, and the next decade of his rule would be defined by violence and terror. Many years after Stalin's rise to power, in a very different part of the world, Muammar Gaddafi would become part of a new generation of dictators. But rather than seize power by political maneuvering, he would seize it through revolution.
Many countries in Africa had been only recently receiving their independence after many years of European colonialism. As a result, you had very, very weak institutions in place, which made it easier for personalist-style leaders to take over.
Libya was one of the world's poorest nations, so the discovery of oil in 1959 should have transformed the country. But in an effort to centralize economic control, the pro-Western monarch, King Idris, abolished regional governments.
The king was viewed as incredibly corrupt, incompetent. He was viewed as a traitor for supporting the West.
Muammar Gaddafi was a captain in the Libyan military and vehemently opposed Western imperialism.
Gaddafi rose to power gradually through the military. His rise to power was very much through opportunism, and he was a self-made person with tremendous amount of charisma.
He built the Free Unionist Officers Movement in 1964 and plotted against the monarchy. 5 years later, they were ready to strike at Libya's heart. On September 1st, 1969, while King Idris was away in Turkey, they pounced. Gaddafi's troops seized control of airports, radio stations, the military headquarters, and government offices. The coup met little resistance, and the monarchist government crumbled within hours. Gaddafi had firmly established himself as the nation's supreme leader. As Gaddafi took the reins of power in Libya in 1969, his first order of business was to cleanse the country of its past, tearing down any remnants of the former regime. Rather than restore power to a civilian-led government, Gaddafi promoted himself to colonel and seized control of the armed forces.
His rhetoric was about how he was building a new kind of democracy, but that was a complete sham. At the end of the day, Gaddafi's leadership was characterized by absolute ruthlessness.
Libya was transformed. Though there were positive changes, such as improvements to irrigation, healthcare, and education, many other changes were brutal and draconian. Freedom of speech was quashed, and violent repression was rampant. But Gaddafi's popular revolution reflected his unwavering resolve to see his revolutionary ideals realized, even if it meant dragging his people to his version of paradise in chains. Not long after Gaddafi's rise to power, another nation would prove itself a powder keg for revolution. And the people of Chile in the early 1970s were ready to light the match. Augusto Pinochet was a decorated career soldier. He didn't seem to have any aspirations of political leadership, but events in September 1973 would propel him towards absolute power.
In the 1970s, Chile had huge gaps between rich and poor. In this backdrop, you saw the election of Salvador Allende. He was a socialist leader. He wanted to reform the Chilean state.
In the midst of the Cold War, however, the U.S. saw Allende's socialist policies as a bit too communist.
As soon as he was elected in 1970, the U.S. set out to undermine him. They stopped providing Chile with financial aid, and Allende's socialist program was torpedoed by the U.S. involvement and the U.S. plans to push him out of power.
By spring of 1973, with an economy in crisis and amidst ongoing strikes and protests and his diminishing support within the military, General Prats resigned as commander-in-chief. And President Allende promoted Augusto Pinochet in his place. Allende was unaware he had just set the stage for his own downfall, and for Chile's darkest days. With mounting public disdain for Allende's regime, Pinochet led a violent coup to dismantle the socialist government. Pinochet's coup quickly took shape in the naval city of Valparaiso. By late morning, his armed forces had taken control of almost all of Chile.
September 11th, 1973, the day that Chilean democracy died at the hands of the military.
The military encircled the Chilean presidential palace. Salvador Allende was given the choice to resign or flee the country, and he died of mysterious circumstances. Either he committed suicide or he was killed inside the palace.
By 2:30 p.m., Pinochet was in charge.
Now, they decided to install Augusto Pinochet in power simply because they thought he was more of a modest leader that wouldn't personalize power in his own hands, but they were wrong. He had huge ambitions.
Pinochet's dictatorship, like a lot of military dictatorships in Latin America, pursued violent repression against its perceived enemies. It imprisoned without trial, torture, disappearance, murder.
Pinochet rapidly militarized the government, placing trusted army personnel in pivotal administrative roles and integrating all security forces into the secret police. The urban poor, workers, and small rural landholders bore the brunt of this new regime, with their rights and dignities stripped away. By December of 1973, Pinochet had torn down the remnants of Allende's rule, firmly established himself as the president of Chile, and ruled as an authoritarian dictator for 17 years. Tearing down old regimes, ruling through repression and the ambition of power. All hallmarks of Pinochet's rule, but also of Benito Mussolini's consolidation of power decades earlier. When Mussolini was appointed as prime minister in October 1922, he led a coalition government. Still a far cry from his vision of a fascist Italy, unified under state power.
Of course, he uses the opportunity to build his power little by little, and he uses a dual strategy. On the one hand, the Sud, the respectable side of fascism, will empower Mussolini. On the other side, the bludgeon, the street violence behind the scenes.
Little by little, Mussolini worked to erode the political system until it reflected his ultimate fascist ideal. In November 1923, Parliament passed the Acerbo Act, in which the party winning the largest share of votes would gain a two-thirds majority in the House. This would essentially eliminate all opposition in Parliament. In 1924, under an atmosphere of terror, Mussolini's fascist party won two-thirds of votes at the general election. Then, in 1925, with a parliamentary majority, he declared a full dictatorship.
Once Mussolini becomes the dictator, he has free reign. At that point, he subjugates his own political party, because of course he wants them, but he doesn't want them to be rogue forces that even challenge his own authority.
By 1928, a series of laws were passed that dismantled democratic institutions, established a one-party state, and confirmed Mussolini's position as the sole leader, or Il Duce, with control over all government functions. His brutal reign would last for 2 decades, culminating in an alliance with Nazi Germany in the Second World War. Dictators all use similar techniques to consolidate power and suppress opposition. Mao Zedong is no exception.
When the CCP takes power in October 1949 and proclaims the People's Republic of China, they realize that they are now in control of an entire country for the first time ever. And their numerically and technologically superior nationalist enemies still have what they view as real presences and real influence in the country.
And it requires a campaign on multiple levels to bend the country's will to the regime.
They continue the land reform to root that type of influence and presence out at the countryside level. So that's getting rid of loyalists to the Kuomintang, the nationalists, getting rid of landlords who had a lot to gain from the nationalist system, to stamp out those quote-unquote capitalist tendencies at the countryside level.
Redistributing land from landlords to peasants dismantled the old feudal hierarchy and garnered support from the peasantry, who were the bulk of the population.
In the cities, the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries was an actual effort by the CCP to identify and root these nationalists out and then have them either purged, reformed through labor, or executed outright.
Intellectuals, teachers, scientists, as well as artists and writers were all caught up in the purges. Any free thinkers was seen as a threat to Maoist ideology.
This is one of the most brutal campaigns of the early PRC years and culminates in a declaration that they've eliminated these tendencies and eliminated these counter-revolutionaries from China, and the party can now effectively proceed with implementing socialism and communism in China. And this is Mao's goal, right? They've taken over, they've established a People's Republic.
Nothing less than total compliance. Dissidents are purged. A standard part of the dictator's playbook, and necessary to a totalitarian state. But when the leader's paranoia is so great, they start to see enemies everywhere. Almost a decade into Stalin's leadership, in 1936, the Soviet Union saw one of the most chilling episodes under Stalin's regime. During the Great Purge, everyone was a potential suspect.
It begins with terror against the party and the elite in the state, but it very quickly encompasses wide sectors of the population, and they go for all sorts of other social marginals. And that is anybody who they assume would be an enemy of Soviet powers.
So Stalin saw the Soviet Union as a huge fortress, and the secret police was there to purge any attempt to undermine the fortress. So his vision of socialism was the beleaguered, threatened fortress.
The largest number of executions in the Great Terror are rank-and-file Soviet people, not the elites with whom the whole thing started.
After enduring threats, torture, and interrogations, many accused would confess to crimes they didn't commit. Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, decided the fate of accused anti-Soviets on the spot, often leading to swift executions. In his extreme paranoia, Stalin believed that 30,000 members of the Red Army were plotting against him and had them executed. And, in a chilling twist, he made families liable for a man's crimes, which meant children as young as 12 could be executed. And, astonishingly, Stalin went on to eliminate those who had facilitated his rise to power. Estimates put the number of executions during this period at a staggering 750,000. And over 1 million more unfortunate souls were banished to the bleak and unforgiving gulags. As bold and hateful as Stalin's actions were, he operated from the shadows, his authority a concealed omnipresence. If Stalin's power was an implied whisper, Hitler's was a declarative shout. His authority was unapologetically open, and he knew how to seize an opportunity. He was Chancellor of Germany for now, but with a few more steps, he could be all-powerful. He could be Führer.
In February 1933, only weeks after Hitler comes to power, the Reichstag building burns down. Whether the Nazis are responsible for that fire or not is a moot point. However, he uses that opportunity to convince the political establishment and also President Hindenburg to give him emergency powers.
Hitler and his cohorts manipulated the narrative, painting the communists as the villains, and insisted that Germany teetered on the edge of insurrection.
Emergency power means a fundamental strengthening of the authority of the government against the wishes of the parliament, in defiance of the parliament. It gives them the right to crush the opposition, to close down the press. That is a fundamental point that allowed Hitler to become a dictator even before he assumes full power.
The Reichstag fire decree was a warning of what was to come. The Constitution was suspended, civil liberties were curtailed, and freedom of expression gone. The regime was empowered to arbitrarily arrest and suppress political opponents, dismantle organizations, and stifle publications. Germany was transformed into a police state literally overnight. By the end of March, when the Reichstag convened in Berlin, the stage was set for an aggressive move. The Enabling Act, a law that would grant Hitler unparalleled power, was introduced. Held in what Hitler called protective custody, more than 100 lawmakers and rival parties were prevented from participating in the vote. The SS was stationed within the chamber to pressure the remaining representatives, and unsurprisingly, the law passed with a supermajority. It was a stunningly fast political coup.
When President Hindenburg died on the 2nd of August 1934, Hitler very quickly took a new title for himself as Führer and Reich Chancellor, which meant that all power was his and his alone. On the very same day, the army swore an unconditional oath of personal allegiance to Hitler himself. So not to the state, not to Germany, but to Hitler himself. So after the death of President Hindenburg, then Hitler took all executive power to himself as Führer and Reichschancellor. That really was the end of democracy.
And so started a brutal dictatorship, underpinned by a thin veil of legality. A wave of anti-Semitism swept Germany. Anything deemed un-German was eradicated. Violence on the street escalated, and up to 200,000 individuals were incarcerated in concentration camps. And with a firm stranglehold over Germany and total power finally in his grasp, Hitler's gaze began to shift. The Führer now set his sights on the larger European canvas. The rise of a dictator seldom starts with aspirations of power. Their single focus is to bring about what they believe to be positive change. But they can't do it alone. They are the architects of chaos. And throughout history, tyrants have all worked from the same playbook. They prey on public apathy. They harness people's prejudice. They discredit information sources. They invent enemies. And they lie with impunity. As they transform their country, dictators are seduced by power, blind to their loss of idealism and to the oppression and pain left in their wake.